The Alabama summer hung heavy in the air, thick and humid, the kind of heat that made even breathing feel like a chore. Ethan sat on the porch swing, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand. He'd been in town less than an hour, and already he was questioning his decision to spend his summer break with Grandma Helen. He should be back in Mobile, hanging out with friends, maybe even finding a summer job. But Robert, his dad, had insisted. "Go visit your grandma," he'd said, his voice firm but laced with a hint of wistfulness. "It's been too long." Ethan had argued, of course. The thought of spending weeks in a sleepy Alabama town miles away from anything even remotely resembling excitement filled him with dread. But Robert wouldn't budge. So here he was, stuck in Grandma Helen's ramshackle old house, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of a lawnmower. He sighed, taking a long gulp of his tea. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Grandma Helen always made the best peach cobbler. And who knew? Maybe he'd actually get some reading done. He'd brought a stack of books, determined to make a dent in his summer reading list. Just then, a car pulled into the driveway, its tires crunching on the gravel. Ethan turned, his curiosity piqued. A woman stepped out of the driver's side, her figure silhouetted against the setting sun. She was tall, with long, dark hair that cascaded down her back like a waterfall. Even from a distance, Ethan could tell she was beautiful. "Ethan, honey, come say hello," Grandma Helen called from the doorway. "It's Mrs. Robinson, our neighbor." Ethan set down his glass and walked towards the car, his heart beating a little faster than usual. He had a feeling this summer might be more interesting than he thought. The Alabama heat was relentless, even after the sun dipped below the horizon. Ethan, used to the air-conditioned comfort of his life in Mobile, found himself sweating through his shirt just sitting on the porch. "Why don't you come inside, Ethan?" Grandma Helen suggested. "It's cooler in here." Ethan followed her inside, grateful for the slight reprieve from the heat. The house, though old and creaky, had a certain charm to it. He stretched out on the cool tile floor, hoping to catch a nap before dinner. The lack of air conditioning was starting to get to him. He tossed and turned for what felt like hours, the heat clinging to him like a second skin. He finally drifted off, only to be startled awake by Grandma Helen's voice. "Ethan, dinner's ready. Goodness, you sleep like a log." Ethan sat up, groaning. He looked at his watch. 6 o'clock already?" he mumbled. "I slept the whole afternoon?" "Don't worry, honey. There's plenty of food," Grandma Helen chuckled. "You must be tired from your trip." Ethan joined Grandma Helen at the kitchen table, his stomach rumbling. He'd skipped lunch, and the aroma of fried chicken and mashed potatoes was making his mouth water. "Do the power outages still happen here, Grandma?" he asked, remembering the frequent blackouts from his childhood visits. "Oh yes," Grandma Helen sighed, "but it's usually just at night, from 9 to 6. They have to save power for the irrigation systems." Ethan nodded, secretly relieved. He wouldn't mind some peace and quiet in the evenings. Just then, they heard the rumble of a car engine pulling into the driveway. Ethan looked out the window and saw Mrs. Robinson getting out of her car, her young son, Caleb, trailing behind her. Ethan watched as Mrs. Robinson entered the kitchen, her smile radiant, her eyes sparkling. He felt a strange flutter in his chest, a mixture of nervousness and excitement that he couldn't quite explain. Later that night, Ethan found himself wide awake, his heart pounding. He'd had too much sweet tea at dinner, and now his bladder was screaming for relief. He tiptoed out of bed, careful not to wake Grandma Helen. He just reached the back door when he remembered the dog, a grumpy old hound that seemed to dislike everyone except Grandma Helen. He didn't want to risk getting bitten in the dark, so he crept back towards the bedrooms, hoping to find Mrs. Robinson awake. He quietly pushed open the door to her room, a sliver of moonlight illuminating the bed. Mrs. Robinson was asleep, her long hair spread out on the pillow like a dark halo. Ethan hesitated, feeling a sudden rush of heat creep up his neck. He should just turn around and go back to bed, but something kept him rooted to the spot. He took a step closer, his eyes drawn to the curve of her hip, the swell of her. Ethan's face flushed, and he quickly looked away, his heart pounding in his chest. He was being a creep, spying on her like this. Just then, the urge to pee hit him again, stronger this time. He couldn't hold it any longer. "Mrs. Robinson?" he whispered, his voice cracking with nervousness. She stirred, mumbling something incoherent. "Mrs. Robinson, it's me, Ethan. I need to use the bathroom, but the dog's outside." Mrs. Robinson sat up, blinking sleepily. "Ethan, what's wrong?" "I need to go, but I'm scared of the dog." "Oh, of course, honey," she said, fumbling for her robe. "I'll let you out." As she walked past him, Ethan caught a glimpse of her nightgown, the delicate lace strap slipping down her shoulder. He averted his gaze, his cheeks burning. He hurried outside, relieved to finally relieve himself. The next morning, Ethan woke with a start, his mind replaying the events of the night before. He couldn't believe he'd been so forward. He felt a mixture of shame and a strange, unfamiliar excitement. He avoided Mrs. Robinson's eyes during breakfast, focusing instead on his plate of scrambled eggs and bacon. After breakfast, Grandma Helen announced she was going to visit Mrs. Peterson, her friend from church, and Ethan helped Mrs. Robinson with the dishes. Ethan's heart sank. He'd rather face a pack of wild dogs than spend the day alone with Mrs. Robinson. As they washed dishes, a tense silence hung in the air. Ethan tried to focus on scrubbing pots and pans, but his eyes kept darting to Mrs. Robinson, her back to him, her hips swaying slightly as she worked. "So," Mrs. Robinson began, her voice soft and teasing, "you scared me half to death last night. I thought we had a burglar." Ethan's face flushed. He hoped she wouldn't bring it up. "Oh, I'm so sorry," he stammered, his eyes fixed on the soapy water. "I didn't mean to scare you. That dog is just intimidating." "It's all right, honey," she chuckled, "but next time just knock on my door, okay?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Yeah. "Okay," he mumbled, feeling the heat creep up his neck again. "You're awfully quiet this morning, Ethan," Mrs. Robinson said, turning to face him. "Everything all right?" Ethan avoided her gaze. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." She stepped closer, her perfume filling his senses. You remind me so much of your uncle at that age. Same shy smile, same nervous energy." Ethan's pulse quickened. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, his throat suddenly dry. Just then, Grandma Helen came bustling into the kitchen, a straw hat perched on her head. "Headed to church, Rosemary?" Mrs. Robinson asked. "That's right," Grandma Helen replied, grabbing her purse. "Ethan, I should be back by lunchtime. Be a good boy for Mrs. Robinson, you hear?" Ethan nodded, his stomach churning. As soon as Grandma Helen left, the silence in the kitchen felt charged, electric. Ethan tried to keep his distance, but Mrs. Robinson seemed determined to stay close. "You're sure you're all right, Ethan?" she asked, her voice soft and concerned. "You seem a little on edge." Ethan cleared his throat. I can't stop thinking about last night," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Robinson smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. "Oh? And what about last night is keeping you so preoccupied?" Ethan swallowed hard, his heart pounding against his ribs. He'd never been good at hiding his feelings, and now, facing Mrs. Robinson's direct gaze, he felt exposed, vulnerable. "Yes, Ethan." Mrs. Robinson leaned closer, her breath warm on his cheek. "What is it?" Ethan took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't stop thinking about what I saw." Mrs. Robinson's breath hitched, and for a moment Ethan thought he'd gone too far. But then a slow smile spread across her lips. "What I saw," she repeated, her voice husky. Ethan nodded, unable to tear his gaze away. "And what if, hypothetically speaking, what if you had, he stammered, his cheeks burning. "Had what, Ethan?" Mrs. Robinson leaned in, her eyes sparkling with amusement. Ethan swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "Kissed me, touched me." Mrs. Robinson's smile widened, and for a split second, Ethan thought she might actually say yes. But then she stepped back, shaking her head. "Ethan, honey, you're a sweet boy, but what?" Ethan blurted out, his heart sinking. Mrs. Robinson sighed. "Let's just say it's complicated. Now, why don't you go upstairs and take a nap? You look exhausted." Ethan, deflated and confused, trudged upstairs, his mind reeling. He didn't understand. If she wasn't interested, why had she been flirting with him? Why did she have to make things so complicated? He spent the rest of the afternoon lost in his thoughts, trying to figure out Mrs. Robinson and the strange hold she seemed to have over him. He couldn't deny his attraction to her. But he knew he had to be careful. She was his uncle's ex-wife, for crying out loud. And besides, Grandma Helen would have a fit if she ever found out. He tried to distract himself with a book, but the words blurred on the page. His mind kept replaying the events of the past 24 hours. The way Mrs. Robinson's eyes had lingered on him during dinner, the softness of her voice when she spoke to him, the intoxicating scent of her perfume. He finally drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the day. He was awakened by the sound of voices downstairs. He looked at his watch. It was already past 5. He got up and went to the top of the stairs. Grandma Helen was in the living room, chatting with another older woman. "Ethan, come say hello to Mrs. Peterson," Grandma Helen called. Ethan walked downstairs, his mind still foggy from his nap. "My, how you've grown!" Mrs. Peterson exclaimed, her eyes twinkling. "You're a handsome young man now." Ethan mumbled a greeting, his cheeks flushing. "Rosemary, you're lucky to have such a handsome grandson visiting," Mrs. Peterson continued. "My own grandchildren never come to see me anymore. Too busy with their lives in the city." Grandma Helen smiled. "Ethan's a good boy. He's been helping me around the house all day." Ethan's gaze met Mrs. Robinson's for a fleeting moment, and he thought he saw a flicker of amusement in her eyes. He quickly looked away, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm going to go wash up," he muttered, making a hasty escape to the bathroom. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to cool down the fire that seemed to be burning inside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. As they were finishing dinner, Grandma Helen announced, "I'm going to head over to the community center tonight. They're having a potluck dinner for the senior citizens." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Another event?" "Oh, honey, it's not just an event," Grandma Helen chuckled. "It's a social gathering. A chance for us old folks to get out and socialize." She turned to Mrs. Robinson. "Rosemary, you want to come with me?" "I wish I could, Helen, but I have to work tomorrow morning," Mrs. Robinson replied. "Besides, I think Ethan might need some company tonight." Ethan's heart leaped into his throat. Alone with Mrs. Robinson? The thought sent a shiver of anticipation down his spine. "Ethan, why don't you drive Grandma Helen to the community center?" Mrs. Robinson suggested, her eyes twinkling. "It's a bit of a walk, and it's getting dark." Ethan, despite his inner turmoil, couldn't refuse. He grabbed the keys to his dad's old pickup truck and helped Grandma Helen and Mrs. Peterson into the cab. "Be careful driving down that old dirt road, Ethan," Grandma Helen warned. "It's full of potholes." Ethan nodded, his mind already racing ahead to the evening that awaited him. As he drove down the dusty road, the setting sun casting long shadows across the fields, Ethan felt a sense of unease creep over him. He was about to spend the evening alone with Mrs. Robinson, a woman who both intrigued and terrified him. He pulled up to the community center, a small white building nestled among towering oak trees. "All right, you two have fun," Ethan said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Don't worry, Ethan. I'll be home late," Grandma Helen said, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Rosemary's going to make sure you don't get into any trouble." Ethan watched as they walked towards the building, their laughter echoing in the twilight air. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had the whole evening ahead of him, and he had a feeling things were about to get very interesting. Ethan pulled into the driveway, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. He hopped out of the truck, barely able to contain his excitement as he imagined the evening ahead. He was just reaching for the front door when a dark shape lunged at him, barking ferociously. He stumbled back, tripping over his own feet, his heart racing. "Damn dog," he muttered under his breath, his voice shaky. Caleb came running out of the house, waving a broom. "Scat, Buster, scat!" he yelled, shooing the dog away. Mrs. Robinson appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with concern. "Ethan, are you all right? That darn dog." "I'm fine," Ethan said, his voice still a little shaky. "Just surprised me, that's all." He followed Mrs. Robinson into the house, his mind racing. Grandma Helen was gone for the night. He was alone with Mrs. Robinson. "Where's your grandma?" she asked, setting a plate of fried chicken and biscuits on the table. Ethan, remembering Grandma Helen's parting words, couldn't help but smirk. "She's spending the night at Mrs. Peterson's. Said she'd be back tomorrow morning." "Oh, really?" Mrs. Robinson's eyebrows shot up. Ethan could feel the heat rising in his cheeks as he avoided her gaze. He sat down at the table, his mind buzzing with possibilities. He watched as Caleb, oblivious to the tension in the air, drenched his biscuits in gravy. "Caleb, honey, not so much gravy," Mrs. Robinson said gently. "You'll be up all night with a tummy ache." Ethan, seizing an opportunity to tease Mrs. Robinson, grinned. Yeah, Caleb, don't drink so much. You don't want to have an accident in the middle of the night. He winked at Mrs. Robinson, who blushed and quickly turned away, her cheeks turning a delicate shade of pink. After dinner, Ethan found himself pacing the living room, his nerves on edge. He kept glancing at the clock, wishing time would move faster. He had to find a way to be alone with Mrs. Robinson. He noticed her clearing the dinner dishes and followed her into the kitchen. Mrs. Robinson, he began, his voice a little too loud. Ethan, please. Call me Rosemary, she said, smiling softly. Ethan cleared his throat, his heart beating faster. Rosemary, I was wondering, would you like to sit on the porch and have a drink with me? It's cooler out there now. I'd like that, she said, her eyes meeting his. They sat on the porch swing, sipping iced tea and talking about everything and nothing. Ethan found himself captivated by Rosemary's easy laughter, the way her eyes sparkled in the moonlight. He couldn't remember ever feeling this way about a woman before. As the evening wore on, Ethan's nerves were stretched taut, like a guitar string about to snap. He kept stealing glances at Rosemary, her beauty even more striking in the soft glow of the porch light. When it was time for bed, Ethan lingered in the doorway of his room, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He turned to Rosemary, his voice barely above a whisper. Rosemary, if I need to use the bathroom later, can I knock on your door? Rosemary's lips curved into a knowing smile. Of course, Ethan. Don't hesitate. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he closed the door to his room. He felt a mixture of excitement and fear, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew he was playing with fire, but he couldn't seem to help himself. He lay in bed, his body buzzing with anticipation. He kept checking his watch, counting down the minutes until he could make his move. Finally, when the clock struck 1, he couldn't take it anymore. He crept out of bed, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor. He tiptoed down the hallway, his hand trembling as he reached for Rosemary's door. He paused, his heart pounding in his chest. What was he doing? This was crazy. He should just go back to bed. But he couldn't. He was drawn to her, like a moth to a flame. He pushed the door open slowly, a sliver of moonlight illuminating the room. Rosemary was asleep, her long hair spread out on the pillow like a silken waterfall. Ethan stood there for a moment, just watching her, his breath caught in his throat. He took a step closer, his eyes tracing the curve of her hip, the swell of her breast beneath the thin fabric of her nightgown. He could hear the soft rhythm of her breathing, smell the faint scent of her perfume. He reached out, his hand trembling, and gently brushed a stray strand of hair away from her face. Her skin was soft, warm. He leaned in closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to kiss her, to taste her, to lose himself in her, but he hesitated. What if she woke up? What if she rejected him? He pulled back, his hand hovering over her body. He couldn't bring himself to touch her, not while she was asleep. He turned and walked away, his heart heavy with disappointment and a strange sense of relief. He was in over his head and he knew it, but he couldn't seem to stop himself from falling deeper and deeper into the dangerous current of his desires. Rosemary? He whispered. Rosemary, wake up. She didn't stir. Ethan's hand trembled as he reached for the hem of her nightgown. He slowly pulled it up, exposing her bare legs. He ran his hand along her smooth skin, his breath catching in his throat. He'd never touched a woman like this before, and the feeling was intoxicating. He leaned in and kissed her thigh, his lips lingering on her soft skin. He heard Rosemary's breath hitch, and he knew she was awake. Rosemary, he whispered, his voice hoarse with desire. Don't pretend you're asleep. I know you're awake. She turned to face him, her eyes shining in the darkness. Ethan, what are you doing? She breathed, her voice husky with sleep. I can't help myself, he murmured, his lips brushing against hers. I want you, Rosemary. I've wanted you all day. Rosemary hesitated for a moment, then her arms reached up and pulled him closer. Ethan, she whispered, her voice a mixture of longing and warning. This is crazy. We can't. I know, he murmured, his lips finding hers. But I can't stop. And with that, they were lost in a whirlwind of passion, their bodies pressed together, their breaths mingling in the darkness. Ethan felt a surge of exhilaration, of pure, unadulterated bliss, as he lost himself in the moment. The rest of the night was a blur of stolen kisses, whispered promises, and the intoxicating scent of Rosemary's perfume. As the first rays of dawn crept through the window, Ethan slipped out of Rosemary's bed and returned to his room, his heart pounding, his mind reeling from the experience. The next few days were a whirlwind of secret rendezvous, stolen moments in the barn, behind the shed, anywhere they could find a moment of privacy. Ethan was consumed by his desire for Rosemary, unable to think of anything else. He knew it couldn't last, that this forbidden affair was a ticking time bomb. But he couldn't bring himself to care. He was living in the moment, lost in the intoxicating embrace of a woman who had awakened something deep inside him, something he never knew existed. The morning he was supposed to leave, Ethan found himself lingering in Rosemary's arms, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was goodbye. "I'll be back," he whispered, his lips brushing against hers. "I promise?" Rosemary smiled sadly. "I'll be here waiting, Ethan." Ethan drove away from Grandma Helen's house, his heart a tangled mess of emotions. He knew he had crossed a line, that what he had done with Rosemary was wrong. But he couldn't deny the feelings that stirred within him, the memories that would forever be etched in his mind. He had come to Alabama expecting a boring summer, but he was leaving with a secret that would forever change him. A secret that would haunt him, tempt him, and forever remind him of the summer he fell in love with Mrs. Robinson.